being here. Delighted to introduce Dr. Tamborini here, who's our speaker from Michigan State. And several of you know Ron, and several of you have heard of Ron and have read his work. For over 25 to 30 years, Ron has been one of the prime people at the forefront of media effects in several different domains, but particularly with respect to entertainment as media effect. He's one of the bright and premier torchbearers of arguably the most famous research lineage in mass communication, and inarguably the most famous lineage in media effects, certainly so part of the Zillman lineage. So as part of the lineage, he has his younger sister sitting in the audience here today, and obviously done a lot of great work in this area. Ron's publishing record is just incredibly extensive and also exhaustive. So he's published in just about every top journal, and also published many times in all of these journals as well. There's a lot of different hallmarks. He's extremely theoretical, but also just a superb methodologist. And he's now the managing editor of one of the premier journals in our field, Media Psychology. And you'll learn so much interacting with Ron, both as editor and sometimes also sadly as some of the submitted papers too, as you hear back in terms of how harsh he sometimes can be. But that just again speaks to how rigorous he is. In terms of a few personal notes, this is something that Ron doesn't know, but I'm going to share this now. In terms of how highly I regard his work, I've had opportunity to review 4 of Ron's manuscripts. And when I say that all 4 of them have been published or are about to be published, that just tells you in terms of how highly I think of his work too. So I think only a few years you know that. Yeah. Ron's, like I mentioned, so much of his work is focused on entertainment as media effect. He's also been doing a lot of interesting work in context of new media. A lot of this work is focused in the area of video games, but also looking at aspects of augmented and virtual reality. And some of his recent work has looked at media and morality, and looking at it in terms of the reciprocal influence of media and morality. So that's something which he is going to talk to us about today. So welcome to chat with us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I want to tell you how much I appreciate being here. I occasionally get invited to go places and do presentations, and usually I say thank you, but no, it takes too much time away from my schedule. But when Sri asked me to come here, I was delighted to come here because although I love Michigan State University because it's the best basketball program in the world, if there's any place that I would rather be besides Michigan State, it's here in North Carolina.
Now, I asked you to apply for a job and you said no.
Any other place besides Michigan?
I see.
I actually do have family that live here in North Carolina, so I come a couple of times a year to visit, and it's just a beautiful place. I had never been to the campus before. It's lovely, and thank you so much for inviting me. When Sri asked me to come, I was speaking to him last night, and I said, well, how formal or informal is this? Did I mess that up?
I'm trying to maybe the vote in the projector one actually showing up on this.
Yes, I saw it there.
I think it's, I see something.
It's blinking green.
Well, fortunately, there isn't anything up there yet so I'll just keep on telling you. I asked him if this was going to be formal or informal. He said very informal. So I said, can I wear my hat? Because people who know me, I always wear my hat. So he said, yes, please wear your hat. But people who know Sri, so, I hadn't seen him for about a year, and the last time I'd never seen him without his hat. He took his hat off. So out of respect for Sri, if the camera reflects poorly on my head, I apologize. But we'll go this way. And,
there it is.
So let there be light.
So, coming from the north, I'm used to cool weather, and if I get a little pull out.
Well, we had it on 80 for some reason.
Oh.
I'll turn it down a bit. I'm
I
not
thought
sure
it was
why.
me, and my blood just hadn't thinned since I came down.
So now I put it back to 70. Maybe that's
Thank you very much. So, at lunch today, Dr. Brown and Sri started quizzing me already by saying, now how do you define morality? And I went through a long explanation, roundabout explanation, to tell how I got to the work that I'm doing now. And I really got to it by a number of interests. I have been doing work in a variety of different areas. And a little while ago, I got into I wouldn't call it a debate, but one of my favorite colleagues and scholars is Mary Beth Oliver. Some of you know, she's been here. And Mary Beth and I are always arguing with each other because that's how we learn from each other. I come from an Italian culture where everybody is always in each other's face, and you argue with the people that you love because you can learn from them that way, and you treat everyone else politely, and sometimes I don't learn as much when I'm polite. So I always learn a lot from Mary Beth. And we have been discussing a concept that she had introduced, trying to distinguish reactions that people had to different types of entertainment. I've always been interested in entertainment. And Mary Beth had started to try to distinguish enjoyment versus appreciation in entertainment. And most of the things that I do, I approach from a functional perspective, trying to understand the role that media serves in people's lives, and looking at what needs might drive different types of media uses. And when Mary Beth started talking to me about the distinction between enjoyment and appreciation, she was talking about different types of needs that people, she was talking about it in terms that I understood as different needs that could be satisfied in different ways. And I tried to explain to her that I thought the distinction she was trying to make between enjoyment and appreciation could be understood as different ways of satisfying needs. That when we have different needs, of course, and when all of our needs are satisfied by some type of experience, we have this overwhelmingly positive response to it. For example, some people might call it joy. So if I was watching a movie and I just loved everything about the movie and it satisfied all my needs, I might say, oh wow, I love that movie. On the other hand, there might be a movie where maybe there are different needs that I have. Some are satisfied by the experience and some aren't. Sometimes some are even in conflict. I might watch a narrative story where some of the activities, I watched Schindler's, which was, you know, my plate slips sometimes. If I watch Schindler's List, I might come out of the movie and say, wow, that was a great movie. And somebody asked me, did you like it? I said, yeah, I really liked it. But it's not the same as I felt when I experienced great joy. That the difference was when I was watching Schindler's List, that there were different values that I experienced, different needs that were driving me that were in conflict with each other. And maybe I really appreciated the fact that this person sacrificed, you know, so much of his life to save some people, but so many other people died. So whereas overall, when I judge my response to this, I have a very positive evaluation of the experience, there's still some lingering thoughts in my mind. So I might say, I appreciated it, I didn't enjoy it. Well, when I was going through this discussion of trying to distinguish enjoyment and appreciation with Mary Beth, it made me start to think about what types of things might be in conflict. And of course, there are a lot of different needs, drives that might conflict with each other that could influence the way we responded to something. But particularly in narrative media, a lot of these things deal with issues of morality. So I started to consider experiences where, oh wow, everything that I saw in this movie was consistent with my moral values. The good guy wins, the bad guy loses, everything is perfect. I loved it, I enjoyed that. Or situations where here are some of my moral values that are upheld and some that are perhaps violated, but the ones that are upheld were more important than the ones who were violated, so overall I really I guess I have a positive valuation of that, and maybe I would say that I appreciated that. When I started to think about this, I was starting to look at, well, you know, what is morality in that sense? And I started to look in the literature, moral psychology, and moral philosophy, because I had realized that a lot of the work that I'd done for years was really focused on issues of morality, but I was never really satisfied with the fact that some of the studies that I had conducted trying to look at issues of morality in media seemed to lack the type of theoretical foundation that I was looking for that would unite the whole concept that I was trying to investigate. So I ran across work by somebody named Jonathan Haidt, and if I pronounce his name Haidt sometimes, please forgive me, because when I first started reading his work, I knew it looked like his name said Haidt, but I said, nobody would call himself Haidt. He must be Haidt. And the people that were talking to me said, yes, it's Haidt. And then I spoke to somebody who was actually one of his colleagues and said, no, it's Haidt. So if I get his name wrong, please forgive me. And I should, and I'm probably so far, let's see. I'll start here. So, and I can't read my own PowerPoints from here with my vision so bad. But I was asking myself questions like these. Questions about, you know, does morality play a part in media exposure? Does it play a part in selective exposure? Does it play a part in how we interpret the types of programs that we're exposed to? How we respond to different types of media? You know, does it play a part in how our values are formed? Can it change values that have been formed? Right. So those types of questions, of course, were always things that I was interested in. I'm a classic media effects scholar, interested predominantly in entertainment, but never really limited to entertainment. And I'll come to this at the end for all of you journalist that you can help me with some things maybe. Because when I started doing this work, I really was more interested in how news stories might influence our morality, and started to study it in another area because a lot of my work had already been examining other parts of media. Now, in my effort to try to answer these questions, I said, all right, I'm in trouble because there's a lot of ambiguity about what we're talking about when we talk about morality. Are there universal moral principles that shape judgment? And this goes back to who's the former Attorney General Baker? And of course, he was arguing for years that there are universal moral principles that govern everybody's attitudes and values. And of course, from a political perspective, which is not my interest in particular. Asking questions about whether morality is culturally determined, and is morality rational or intuitive. And that's really the part that my interests were focused on, because when I started to read the work by both Kohlberg and Heider and Piaget, the people that media scholars had typically used when they were trying to study issues of morality, I saw that the rationalist models that they were using didn't quite fit with the perspective that I was trying to take. In fact, I studied with a person who believed that most consumers can't tell you what's governing the way they respond to media. That we have these gut responses and we don't really think about it much. When I looked at Haight's work, he had an approach that was very consistent with my thoughts. He had a social intuitionist model that suggested that we have this intuitive gut response to right and wrong, to moral and immoral, and that we had these instinctive responses these instinctive responses are values that we were born with, but that could be shaped through cultural experience. And if we looked at different cultures, we would see that perhaps they had different values because the culture itself had focused on different issues. Now, Haight talks about the fact that there are 5 universal, sometimes he calls them modules, and of course people debate about what a module is, or sometimes he calls them domains, and some people even get upset when I use the word domain. So I'm going to use the word foundations because it's based on his moral foundations theory. His moral foundations theory says that there are 5 different domains, foundations, that are shared universally. He calls them harm and care, fairness and reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, purity, sanctity. But these have evolved over thousands of years. We have, of course, this innate negative reaction to, and of course it might be associated in large part with concepts of empathy, for example. If somebody is harmed, you feel terrible for them. You want to care for people, so it deals with compassion and peace. We have also an intuitive response to issues of fairness and reciprocity. If fairness concepts are violated, we have a very negative reaction to it. Group loyalty, that we have this, again, natural, innate response to in-group support. People that are part of us, or things that we respond positively to, it's us and them type of a notion. And of course, lots of literature in a variety of these areas. That authority, obedience to authority, respect is also something that, again, would have had a value in terms of evolutionary terms. And finally, purity and sanctity, which to me is the toughest one, quite honestly. And it's, I began this work by studying disgust responses, and from this, went into other areas, tying disgust to issues of moral judgment. And this 5th category, purity and sanctity, in some part deals with issues perhaps of contamination, but in other parts it deals with the way people have been talking about it so far, sanctity. Sanctity is kind of a tough notion. A lot of times it gets mixed in with issues of sexuality, with religion. I actually have been thinking about it differently. I actually think it has something to do with, again, this intuitive reaction that we have for elevation. And Haidt does talk about elevation to some extent. I think it's more tied to the sanctity part of this. So he believes that we have these 5 domains, these 5 foundations, that our judgments of right and wrong, good or bad, are based on whether or not the actions and events that we see adhere to or violate these values. Now, he has done some research to suggest that we can even distinguish different types of groups in terms of which of these different values play a more important part in their moral judgment. He talks about the foundation salience, that for some people, certain of these 5 foundations are more salient than others. And we might even distinguish different types of groups based on which of the foundations are more salient for different people. So in some of, and Haidt's very interested in politics, in some of his early work, he compares, he has something he calls his Moral Foundations Questionnaire, the MFQ, and it's supposed to measure each of the 5 domains and how important or salient these domains are to you in your judgments. And what he suggested is, in his research, he shows that conservatives, American conservatives and liberals, I shouldn't say impressed, actually, it's come out. Americans, conservatives, and liberals differ in terms of which of the domains are more salient. That conservatives are kind of equal in terms of how important each of these 5 domains are in their judgments, so that, you know, whether it violated one or the other of the domains or adhered to one or the other of the domains might not matter too much to them. But liberals are a little bit different because for them, 2 of the domains play a much bigger role in determining their judgments of morality than others. In particular, the harm, care, and fairness, reciprocity domains are more important to liberals, and the others are about equally less important. Now, for me, this was interesting because it suggested that we can use these domains to identify different types of groups. And I was interested in whether or not this could also be used to identify different types of audience groups, for example, in entertainment. So, were these valid? Well, I started to look at some of the existing research that Haidt had done. He said, yeah, you can see, you know, if you look at these domains, you can see that, you know, for the liberals, you know, we see harm and fairness are more important. In-group authority and purity are less important. For conservatives, they're about equally important, right? So we can see that that different groups, you know, that these domains that Haidt talks about seem to distinguish these groups. My question was, you know, can this be applied to entertainment or to media generally? I was started with entertainment. And, well, okay, we know that there's evidence that liberals and conservatives have different types of media preferences. So this work with red media, blue media by Anger and Harn talks about how ideology is related, for example, to news exposure. But these aren't really based on Haidt's work. So what we did was, well, we went back to the study that he had done and tried to see if we could replicate the findings with some type of media content. And we looked to see whether or not conservatives and liberals, defined the way he would talk about them, could be identified as media audiences. So we found patterns that were somewhat similar in terms of preference for religious programming. We thought that there would be differences in preference for religious programming between people who were high on the domains that Haidt said represented conservatives or represented liberals. And we found, you know, kind of a very similar pattern. So Alvin Eden and I, who did some initial preliminary work in this area. By the way, I have no idea about time. I'm kind of an absent-minded person. When am I supposed to stop? Is it time yet? I have about 3 more minutes, you said?
50 more minutes, 5-0.
Well, you
But
know,
we'll sit here all day.
And believe me, if I don't know people, I'm very shy. But once I start talking, it's hard to stop me. So, we thought, all right, let's go out and see if we can really apply this principle, this model, this theory, to media use. We started off with some simple tests of intuitive processes that we thought might be important. And Haidt and one of his students, Graham, had done some research to show that the harm and fairness domains predicted people's perceptions of real-world justice and injustice. So we decided we would try to see whether or not predicted people's perceptions of narrative justice and injustice. And what we did was we created different types of stories. And we measured salience of the different domains for people and tried to see whether or not their scores on the Moral Foundation questionnaire that measured the salience of the different domains would predict their reactions to these different types of stories that we had written, you know, to specifically deal with issues of harm and fairness. And yeah, we found some support for that. That harm and fairness differentially predicted both perceived graphicness and the fairness of these narratives. People that were, you know, higher on harm and higher on fairness responded differently to the stories that we had written to manipulate harm and fairness. And it also affected the appeal of the stories. We started off with just harm and fairness. Of course, we were interested in all of the dimensions, so we then replicated the study with, with writing stories that work across all 5 domains and found the same pattern there. It's recently been replicated by one of my students, Nick Bowman, who's not too far from here actually. And he's actually replicated, he's been working with some of our German friends and replicated this both with US and German populations. Now, one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, but I kind of touched on a little bit when I was talking before about the conflicting values, has to do with the dual process logic behind Haig's moral foundation theory. Now, to begin with, I started off by saying that some of the early theories on morality that media scholars have used were rationalist models, the work of people like, Kohlberg, probably the person that gets cited the most. And Kohlberg, of course, talks about morality being a rational decision-making process. Haig says, well, no, there are these intuitive gut reactions that we have that determine our judgments. But he also said that it's not always the case that intuitive response determines judgment. In fact, even though Haig's work focuses more on the intuitive responses, his theory and his model actually suggests that there are two processes. That we have one that's an intuitive system where response is fast and holistic, and a second, which is a rational system that has contemplative thought, and it's a little bit slower and more deliberate. Now, Haig would say that the default is the intuitive response, but that, of course, in some circumstances, intuition doesn't work, and those circumstances, then we would have to revert to rational processing in order to come to some type of a judgment. So, in that story where, everything is wonderful, I can just have this gut reaction, I loved it, but in that story where, there's some things that I agree with and some things that I think are horrible here, I have to think about it a little bit before I come to a determination of whether or not overall I thought it was, a good thing or a bad thing. And those so my thinking was very, fit well with Haig's dual process model. The argument based that rational processing occurs when complexity requires this deliberation. Well, a lot of this was happening at a time when I was doing studies on the difference between enjoyment and appreciation, and I also at the time got asked by Peter Borderer, who's an entertainment scholar, to go to this conference in Spain and give a presentation. Like I said, I usually say no to things, but he was going to pay for me to go to the mountains of Spain, so I said, okay, yes. So last year, we had a conference, an entertainment conference in Spain, and I said, well, if he's going to pay for me to go all the way to Spain, I better try to come up with something new instead of doing the same old stuff that I have been talking about for years. So I spent some time, and the way this was set up, there were like 5 speakers, and we were all supposed to write a chapter that was going to go in this in a publication. Actually, I think it's coming out in the Journal of Media Psychology, the European Journal of Media Psychology. It's about to come out soon. And I started to thinking about the people that were going to be there and what they were going to say and how my work kind of, where it fit with theirs, where it didn't fit with theirs. And I started to work on a model, a broader model, that tried to integrate a lot of the things that I had been thinking about for some time. And this is what the model looked like. So for the last, year or so, I've been focusing a lot of my attention on developing and trying to test this model. I call it the model of intuitive morality in exemplars. My students hate it because every time I say it, they say, oh, are you going to talk about the mind? So I can change it to a theory, and then you won't be so upset. It'll be time instead of mind. The model is, of course, it's a very broad model, and talks about the reciprocal processes that relate media and morality. It suggests, and I'll start any place. I'll start here, and here talking about foundation salience, because I've spoken to you about foundation salience already. The idea is that groups differ, individuals and groups differ in terms of which of the domains are more salient, and which of the domains are going to play a larger role in determining their judgments of morality. What influences or shapes the salience? Well, there are a lot of models. And by the way, this is not anything special in my model. I think really what's perhaps special about my model, there are a lot of recursive models like this out there. And everyone says, oh, it's environment and it's media, the two things together. This is the same thing. It's just that I'm focusing particularly on very specific aspects of outcomes that I think the model should predict. I'm focusing on morality, and I'm basing it on a theory that I think is reasonably well grounded in terms of its definition of morality in a sense that I enjoy and appreciate, and one that's testable so that I can actually see whether or not the concepts of morality as defined by this theory would actually be altered by media exposure. So it starts off by saying that which domains are going to be more salient? What's going to influence that? Well, of course, the main thing that's going to influence that is our environment, our cultural environment, right? But it also suggests that exposure to media can have an influence. If we are continually exposed to certain types of media messages that focus on one of the domains at the expense of the other, we might expect that domain to become, I'll say domain and foundation interchangeably, please forgive me. We might expect that that foundation will grow in its importance to us. It'll become more and more salient after repeated exposure to that, to those messages. So the model starts off by saying that those things can influence foundation salience. One of the things that I pay particular attention to is exemplars, because I think that particularly in narrative media, but also in news media and other media, it's not just how often we're exposed to certain types of messages that influence the salience of those events. It's also characteristics of the message and also the individuals who represent the message. So some of you are probably familiar with Dr. Gibson's research on exemplification. In fact, I even spoke to you on the phone about this once. I don't know if you remember about the I said, can your exemplification theory be applied in this way? And she said no. So I said, all right, I won't call it. She said no because exemplification theory suggests that there's an existing baseline comparison with abstract compared to concrete. And I said, okay, it's not that there has to be a baseline. I'm really just trying to talk about the same attributes of an exemplar that might strengthen its impact. So I changed it from exemplification. I used to call it the model of intuitive morality exemplification. I took the Asian off and just called it the model of intuitive morality and exemplars. Because it really isn't an exemplification process comparing an exemplar to a more abstract message. It's really just talking about the concrete features of certain exemplars that might play a particular role in having a stronger effect on what is salient to us than other things.
I have a question before you go.
You can interrupt me anytime because I don't really know what I'm talking about anyhow. Oh no, I was serious. Oh, please interrupt me anytime. I want everyone else to be able to do that too.
What about, you have exposure to foundation and hearing media, but what if they don't adhere? Most of the media that my students expose themselves to are all against those moral foundations. You should hear about the things they watch and read and do.
That terrible media, it's killing us. It's corrupting our morals.
Their morals.
Their morals. And that's why our morals are superior to your morals.
Actually, yes. So, is there a box for that?
They are the exposure, and I talked, this is a simplified version of the model, quite honestly, because there's lots of information in each of these boxes, but you can't put that up in a notepad like this. I do talk a lot about whether or not the foundation is adhered to or violated.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now there are two things that I think are important. First of all, I think the mere presence of the foundation is important because the more you're exposed to it, it's kind of like the difference between agenda-setting research. In fact, I sometimes talk about part of this as moral agenda setting. In fact, we even are designing some studies that are going to replicate some of the early agenda-setting studies and try to see whether or not we can change not how important somebody thinks the story is, but actually manipulate the salience of the foundation by repeated exposure to certain types of news stories that would have perhaps the same process as some of the early moral agenda-setting studies did.
One question.
Yes.
Why doesn't the cultural environment also impact the media production?
It
and
does.
Also the exposure, because
it does.
Selected, yeah.
It does. It just does it through here. Okay?
Are you sure?
In the model, yes. Am I sure that it happens in real life? Is that what you're asking?
No, of course.
Well, that's you might imagine that this is a huge model, and testing all of this is, of course, an enormous undertaking. Am I convinced that everything in my model is right? I'm convinced it's not all right. Okay? I always begin by saying, I know I'm wrong someplace. Let's find out where. And that's my, that's what I'll be doing for the next few years, trying to figure out which parts of the model seem to be consistent with observation and which aren't. In fact, most of what I'll talk to you about today are the studies that we have conducted on different parts of this model. Some of them are very hard to do.
It seems like every box in the model is part of the culture.
Okay, here's one thing I told Shri today. I said, gosh, if the cultural people come, I'm dead. And of course, it depends on how you define culture, right? And I know I know. One of the people working with me on this is a woman named Dana Mastro. Now, Dana is not a cultural scholar. She's a social scientist, but she studies media representations of cultural minorities. And in fact, why don't we talk about that? Because I'm going to talk about some of the research that Dana and I are doing. And maybe this will help. I don't know. maybe that research will answer part of your question. So looking at both how exposure in culture can influence certain foundation salience, also how it can make certain exemplars more salient. It may be making Jesus more salient. It might be making, President Obama more salient. It might be making some fictional hero more salient. And the attributes that those people carry with them in my model, if Jesus or President Obama or some superhero is, represented as having these attributes, and particularly strong in some more than others, then perhaps those attributes will become more salient in terms of the foundations that govern our judgments. Okay? Whether or not, the question started by, what about violations? And as I said, I believe that merely exposing people repeatedly to different types of foundations is going to make that foundation more important. And I think that's probably true that in some cultures, and this is just speculation on my part totally, that cultures differ in terms of, well, maybe in this culture, certain domains are just more important. In other cultures, other domains are more important. And we might see some differences. One of the things that I haven't put this into any of my work yet, but I really think that we'll find that one of the areas that you see a great deal of focus on are areas where the culture hasn't determined how to respond to something yet. So in some areas, the culture itself is conflicted in terms of how to deal with some type of foundation, and we'll get a lot of focus on those, but that one's a little bit beyond this model right now. Now, just focus should make that more salient to us, but it's also the case as to whether or not it is adhered to or violated. It's going to shape, it's more like, if you, in news terms, framing, isn't it? So we know that frames can also influence whether or not the message that we take away from this is a positive or negative one. And now if you listen to what Haidt says, he says, look, these are inherent. We can't simply change and all of a sudden believe that harm is good, okay? But we can change in terms of understanding whether or not one is more salient than another. And if, for example, our heroes don't demonstrate this type of behavior and they are not adhering to that type of behavior, perhaps that one can become less salient within a culture.
Quick question.
Yes.
Exemplar always means a person, or can it be a situation?
I missed the first part of your question.
The exemplar, is it always a person, or can it be a situation or something, an event?
The bar?
Exemplar.
Oh, the exemplar. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry.
Because you were giving
It doesn't have to be just a person.
Okay.
And you'll see in a moment why I focused on people, because our early research focuses on heroes and villains. Okay, and that's some of the studies that we have been doing in that area. So, how does the salience of these domains influence us? Well, again, we believe that what it's going to do is it's going to affect our automatic response. To begin with, if it's more salient to us, we're likely to pay more attention. If some domain is more salient, we're likely to pay more attention to events, issues, stories that are dealing with that domain. And we might pay less attention if fairness is the most important domain to me, maybe I'll pay more attention more quickly to stories that deal with fairness, and maybe I won't pay attention to the stories that deal with authority, but it's not so salient. Okay? So it's going to affect how much attention we give to something. It's also going to affect that positive or negative response that we have to the event, the story, based on whether or not the event or story adheres to all of our values. Now, no story is going to perfectly adhere to all of our values, so really the way I talk about this is whether or not it adheres to what are the dominantly salient values at the time, the dominantly salient foundations. So some stories are written, news stories, television narratives, they're written to make certain domains particularly salient to us at this time. And even if we have two domains that are equally important to us as a trait, it may be that the story itself makes one of those domains dominantly salient at the time, and if the story resolves itself so that the dominant domain is actually adhered to and the other one is not adhered to, we have this overall positive response. Right? So, and of course, If the bad guy wins, we have a negative response. If the good guy wins, we have a positive response. In simple terms, that's what we're talking about here. And we're defining good guys and bad guys by whether or not they violate or adhere to the domains that are particularly important to us. Okay? Now, then we come to those situations where, and this, like I said, Haig argued that this is the the automatic response. This is what happens most of the time. But then there are some times where, well, the story is probably written, or the event is one where, gee, it's not all perfect. It's not all perfect, is it? There are some good things here, but there are some things that aren't so good, and gosh, how do I respond? Well, instead of having this quick, intuitive gut reaction, then we have to go through a rational process, an appraisal process, some reappraisal process, perhaps. And here we're going to decide to accept or reject the need to violate one of those foundations in order to conform to the other. Now, if we accept the need to, okay, they violated my beliefs in group loyalty in order to, adhere to care, the harm care domain. They went against their family, but they saved 1,000 people's lives. It's terrible if they went, but they did the right thing, right? So now I have this deliberative rational response where I have a positive appraisal. On the other hand, what if family loyalty is so important to me? You never violate family loyalty. This person, went against their family in order to save other people's lives. That's wrong. For somebody for whom loyalty is more important, they might respond to that differently. In either case, we're going to have somebody decide to accept or reject the need to violate one in order to conform to the other. If you accept the need, you have a positive valuation. If you reject the need, you have a negative valuation. Now, what I believe is that there are certainly culturally broad patterns of consistent response. Maybe in one culture, most people would say, no, you have to save 1,000 people instead of adhering to family loyalties, right? So we probably would see this consistent response across large groups of people. Now, these responses, I like it, I dislike it, are going to affect patterns of exposure. And patterns of exposure, of course, are going to feed into media producers. They have the same type of intuitive reactions to things. They understand what audiences like or dislike, and they're producing content that's consistent with their values, the cultural values. They're producing content that consistently adheres to the values that are most important for the members of their culture, and focusing on those, and creating stories that, of course, simply would start to reinforce the existing values. And this will go back to Clapper, that would argue that most of our content reinforces. Yes?
Having the appraisal part outside of the automatic box, are you suggesting that this is a more controlled process versus the automatic responses?
Here, these two?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Actually, believe they may be a function of different types of response systems.
Okay. How controlled do you think, or do you think the appraisal portion of it?
And I don't know. Okay, I certainly would. I'm not going to say that I know, because that would be ludicrous on my part. Now, what I have suggested is that if all the stars line up right, or the stars for what I call the dominantly salient foundations line up right? All of those dominantly salient issues are adhered to, right? Then I think we're going to have that gut intuitive reaction that we don't really have any thought. If not, if something breaks through to the point where I have to reappraise, where's that point where I reappraise? Don't know, right? Are these really qualitatively different response systems? Don't know. But we are trying to test it to find out. In fact, we have some studies that I'll talk about in a minute that we're trying to look at. Okay?
So in terms of the overall valuation that then leads to this selective exposure, at what point, I mean, I know you're talking about the narrative consequences for what's going on in the entertainment media, but at what point do other sorts of factors that influence perceptions of quality fit in? I mean, there are plenty of movies that tell stories that reaffirm salient foundations to me that I don't want to watch because I feel like the actor's uninteresting, right? I want to read something just because the writer's sentence structure is bad, or they always spell something with one N or something like that. And that's enough to make me not enjoy it, right? Especially if I'm on it.
Right.
Yes. Well, remember, I'm not saying that the only values that are important here are moral. Okay, I'm not saying the only things that conflict here are moral domains. You may have a very strong need to have, a grammatically structured, for example, I started my career off as a filmmaker, okay? I never wanted to be a stupid academic, but here I am. Right? I started off teaching television and film production, that's what I wanted to do. And when I started taking those courses, I couldn't go to a movie and enjoy it without tearing it apart. Oh gosh, look at the camera angle on that, look at the transition, right? So I had a need that was, for me, it was very salient to me to have seamless storylines. And if that was violated, then that would be in conflict with other needs that I had. So it's not that, and of course there's a difference between saying that when I talk about enjoyment and appreciation, the difference between enjoyment and appreciation, I talk about not just moral foundations being potentially all lined up or in conflict with each other. In fact, most of the research that I did started with complex autonomy and relatedness from Ryan Deasy's self-determination work, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight with some in Drew's class. So yes, it's not that nothing else can affect our positive or negative valuation. It may be that if I have a negative valuation for some type of adherence to one of my values, that the negative response that I have to this, even though it adhered to my value, might actually somehow taint that value. But I think that's probably theoretically possible, but I think it's practically not likely to happen very much. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. This is a cultural question, okay?
Anybody else want to field this one?
No, but let's just take, for instance, the anti-hero in film,
Yes.
like Jesse James.
Can I ask you to hold that for a second?
Okay.
Because I'm going to talk specifically about differences between heroes and villains in just a minute.
Okay.
Okay?
You mean Jesse James, Sandra Bullock's ex, or Jesse
No,
James?
well, no. But there have been at least 20 or more films made about Jesse James, the post-Civil War anti-hero. And now we have the Barefoot Bandit, so that we're going to make a film.
Yes.
So, I'll wait.
Yeah, wait, because I actually have something that might be related. Okay? Well, anyhow, that's kind of the model, right? And if you're exposed, if the media industry produces lots of this stuff, of course, then people are going to consume it. Like I said, I've been talking mostly about narrative entertainment, but I'm interested in how it appears in all different forms of entertainment, in non-entertainment content. So, what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time talking about 3:15, is that? I don't know what you said. 3
Yes.
3:15? Good. They have a lot of studies. We'll see how many of them I get through. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the stuff that we have been doing to examine parts of the model. So, started off with some research looking at exemplar salience. And actually, this goes right to your point. That's why I was trying to suggest that we might wait for a second. Now, we started off with some simple stuff, asking, we've done a lot of different types of studies, focus group studies, surveys, experiments, content analysis. So we're trying to, even some physiological studies. So we're trying to study this in a variety of different ways. And some of these things, of course, very difficult to study. We started just by asking people, tell us about, think of a hero or a villain from some film, and tell us about that person. We've done this a couple of different ways. We've had people write open-ended responses and coded those to see whether or not they're open-ended responses. We coded them using a scheme that tried to evaluate the 5 foundations. We've also given people questionnaires that lists, how does this character that you like or dislike, how are they in terms of adhering to your principles, your values, dealing with harm, dealing with fairness, dealing with loyalty, etc., etc., etc. So, not surprising, we find out that, I guess they put some fun colorful stuff up here. My students tell me that I'm dry and boring and I should make my slides a little bit more interesting in my discussion. So, Allison Eden and Mary Beth Oliver and me, and those are actually 2 of Mary Beth's students, we did a study where we just went through and asked them, okay, how do heroes and villains differ in terms of how likely they are to violate these different types of these different foundations. Okay, not surprising, all right. Heroes violate less, villains violate more, but it wasn't consistent across all the foundations. And that was important to us. If it was consistent across all the foundations, then I would have said, well, we just have this generalized principle that people are saying heroes are good, villains are bad, but that wasn't the case, right? So in particular, there are again, statistically significant differences in terms of for this study, both authority and purity, that they were more likely to violate purity and still more likely to violate authority than they were likely to violate these other types of domains. Okay. Now that's why I wanted to mention this to you, because you were talking about the anti-hero. I actually think that in American culture, you see that the anti-hero is almost never going to be, different in terms of harm, or care, or fairness, or group. They may be, but here, yeah, you don't have to. You can violate authority in American culture and still be a hero. You can violate purity in American culture and still be a hero. Okay. Now, not as much so as those dastardly villains, right? Yeah, but it's not quite the same. Those aren't the things that are perhaps driving our affective responses to some character in terms of whether or not we think that they're really a nice person or not.
So it's Robin Hood.
Yes, sure. That would be consistent with this, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But that fits the folklore about Jesse James. Because
Yes.
that he robbed from the rich,
Right.
from the trains, and he
Same
gave to the
thing.
poor. It's not true, but anyway.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, but on I had a PhD student who did all this work on Jesse James and how the media perpetuated the stories. And so, it may have been in your face during Reconstruction. It may have been that kind of underlying story.
Yes.
That took place in Missouri. So, but it's interesting to me how we keep making films about this person every half generation. And they're highly seen.
Right.
And people go to them. In the same way with television documentaries about this person. And so there's something that resonates in that entertainment. There's something we really like about it. And maybe it's in your face, or maybe it's like, I can't do that, but I can enjoy seeing something. I don't know what it is. So I'm looking to you to answer.
Well, and it may be this, and probably also a little earlier you talked about our values and their values. And think of how our values were more like their values when we were their age, and how much more important authority became to us when we had kids. So it's not like that nothing in our own life, it's not that our own environment isn't going to change these things, right? So I certainly, my guess is that, yes, it probably resonates. It probably resonates more with people in a certain age group, and I think that at different ages we'll see that these foundational weights will vary over time. And another thing that we're trying to look at. We've started to look at it, but we don't have very good data on it yet. Okay. You're welcome. We started to, compare fictional and real life heroes and villains. We kind of replicated the same study with asking people to think of. And by the way, we didn't just also. I'm one who will try not to limit myself. There are always exceptions that to the rule. So who knows? Maybe Jesse James fits well with the explanation that I'm talking about. Maybe he's different. But what we did was tell people to think of their own hero and villain. So we have hundreds of different heroes and villains. We have some that appear more often than others, but we have lots of them. Same thing here, right? We had a lot of Batmans and Jokers in our first one. That's why I put them up there. We had a lot of moms and dads on my real life heroes. Mother Teresa, soldiers, things like that. And we find that the same kind of pattern existed when we looked at this again, we replicated it. We see the same pattern with the fictional heroes and villains. With the real heroes and villains, a little bit flatter. So maybe maybe I'll accept that violation of authority in some fictional character because I want to be a rebel right now. But when I see some real person do it, maybe it's not such a good thing. I know you talked about that one adolescent, Barefoot Bandit, but that was a different one. I was thinking about the guy that... That's the one, yes, yeah. And I'm still not sure about him and who or why he appeals. So, we've talked about foundation salience as well as exemplar salience. So we've done a lot of research looking at, I started with exemplar salience because it's kind of easier to talk about. But in truth, of course, to me, the more interesting part of this is foundation salience. Are there differences in how salient these different domains are in people? Can we define audiences? For example, I'll talk in a second about Silman's work on morality subcultures. Can we define morality subcultures this way? Well, it's hard to tell whether or not these domains are salient, more or less salient. These are supposed to be intrinsic gut responses. Most of the stuff has been done with self-report measures. How can I tell, how somebody's gut response if their gut response to harm is stronger than their gut response to fairness when I'm asking them, and I said that this is intuitive, and if you have to think about it, it doesn't work. So we still have some problems with this. But we have started to look at some research. Now, Hoffman and Ballmer have created, it's called an AMP, an affect misattribution procedure. Are you guys familiar with the AMP? I'll show you a real quick example in a second. Okay. Basically, you show people things so quickly that they really don't see what they've seen, and then you ask them to respond to it, hoping that their response will somehow indicate an intuitive reaction. Okay? Now, Hoffman and Ballmer created an affect misattribution scale that is, they called it the immediate affect to moral stimuli. They called it their IN scale. Okay? And the reason I like this is because they actually based this on Haight's work. They based it on his notions of harm and care and fairness and authority and purity and all that kind of stuff. So they created this scale, they created an AMP measure to find out which people were more salient across the board, not on separate domains, but across the board on this instinctive morality, this moral intuition. And found that their scale predicted people's responses to scenes that might create feelings of guilt. It's from a moral dilemma scenario. It's the footbridge scenario, if you know the footbridge scenario. There's a trolley coming down the track, and you can save somebody, or in order to save all these other people, you have to push this other person off the footbridge in front of the trolley. You do this, right? And we know that people have, oh God, again, it's that save 5 people, sacrifice 1 person to save 5, that type of thing, right? We know that their intuitive moral emotions predict how people will respond to that. We know that it predicts their anger and reactions to these unfair monetary offers that come about in another task that we see people use to measure this, called the ultimatum game. Now, what they did was to just try to measure moral intuition broadly. We're now trying to create an AMP measure to measure the 5 distinct domains. It's not easy, it's hard. We've been working at it unsuccessfully. And so now we're trying to replicate that and do it with, see if we can create a measure that will identify the salience of the 5 individual domains. No question in my mind that these different domains are interconnected, and the salience of one is likely to influence the salience of the other, especially when you're measuring them. But that's what we're trying to do. If you don't know what an AMP is, right, so basically what they would do is they would say, all right, we're going to show you a series of slides. We want you to, there's going to be just this slide up there to signal that the other one's coming. Then it's going to be this Chinese character, and then you're going to see a gray screen, and we want you to tell us whether or not you think the Chinese character, if you have a positive or a negative reaction to the Chinese character. So it would go something like this, it would go boom, boom, and it would go quicker than that, go much more quickly, right? And now they ask you to judge it positive or negative. Now the idea is they're telling you to judge the Chinese character. But they believe will happen is that your intuitive response to the slide that came before it will influence whether or not you call the Chinese character positive or negative, right? So we have different slides, right? Here, for example, we have this one to measure harm. They would see it very quickly, only for 100 milliseconds.
Oh,
right?
that's a horn.
Yes.
Oh,
God.
That's the idea. That's the idea. And it still affects people's response. Okay? That's the whole idea. It's supposed to measure this at an intuitive level without any rational thought. Okay? So it goes like that. And if my, right? And then that one's like for authority, right? And then sometimes we use words as well. And right, that one's for purity. I only had a few of them. So we're trying to develop this scale and to see whether or not we can actually identify the types of different salience or weights that these different domains have in groups of individuals without having to ask them with paper and pencil questionnaire. Now, certainly there has been a lot of research that has used the paper and pencil questionnaire. Some of that research has tried to look at the relationship between culture and foundation salience. Simply put, are these foundations, do they vary in salience from one culture to another? So one of my students, Nick Bowman, with some of his German friends, have just collected these data. And so what we see here, using the MFQ, just the paper and pencil questionnaire, we can see, all right, here's the pattern that we saw. The red is the US. We can see the pattern that we see, all right, maybe harm and fairness are are more important than some of the other ones in the United States. If you look at the Germans, all right, overall the same pattern, but look, there's big, really pretty big differences in terms of the Germans really score very low on purity, they really score low on loyalty, really score low on authority. And my German friends said this is just what we're going to find. They said especially authority in particular, there's such a negative response to authority since World War II that this is now ingrained in them as a culture. So that's the type of things that we're looking for and looking at. We're doing some of this now also with Spanish-speaking cultures and comparing them to US cultures, but we don't have those data. So we're also looking at, a lot of our research has really focused here about the relationship between foundation salience and these automatic responses. So yeah, kind of cut my teeth on experimental research. I love being in a lab, so that's what most of my studies are. But this other stuff, quite honestly, to me is in many ways just as interesting. So we have several studies that have looked at these automatic responses. One of the first studies we did, as I said, when I started doing this, I said, I think that we can actually try to define some concepts that have been hard for me to define in entertainment literature. One of the theories that has certainly governed a lot of entertainment research is Zillman's disposition theory. And implicit in his theory is that there exists things that he calls morality subcultures. Right? Now, the problem is in research that I've tried to do in this area, is if you don't have some a priori way to define the morality subculture, how do you know if that morality subculture is really influencing what he calls, he says there'll be behaviors, and then different moral subcultures will respond differently in terms of their approbation or disapprobation of the action. Was it good or bad? And that will affect, did I like or dislike the character? If it's truly the case that these morality subcultures exist, then we should be able to see that differences on scores representing these differences should moderate this mediated path, right? So there's actually a mediated relationship between the character's action and whether you like it or dislike it. So what we did was we measured people's salience. We focused on just a couple. We focused on fairness. From some of the previous research, we had seen that fairness seemed to be an important one. So we wrote stories to violate fairness. We measured the salience of fairness, and then saw whether or not people's scores on fairness would moderate this mediated path. And we found that. We found that the salience of fairness moderated the mediation of approbation on the effect of character, action, and disposition. Now, when I saw that, I said, hey, it's not so easy to start with an a priori prediction of a moderated mediation effect and to find it like this. So this is one of the early studies we did, and I started to think, maybe there's something here, and let's keep on. We have been more recently trying to study the same thing, looking at different types of neurological responses to moral violations and adherences, right? So I'm working with, we're looking at the brain, and I like to say I'm not the brains behind this one. I'm the mind person, and Alison Eden, this is her work with me, and Sid Sarabas and Renee Weber, who are the fMRI brains. So basically what we're looking at here is, Renee and I have done a few different studies trying to look at how systems in the brain respond differently to different types of entertainment content, different types of functions. Actually, Renee and I, one of my favorite papers that I've done is this, some of you know the research on flow, experiences of flow, and Renee and I tried to redefine flow because I always thought it was such a big and ambiguous concept that it was hard for me to understand what people were talking about. So we actually tried to define flow as a network of interconnected activity in the brain, and then conducted some research to show that systems of brain responses were consistent with reported experiences of flow. But it's the same thing that we're trying to do here, right? So we're looking at different areas of the brain. I won't get into different areas of the brain, but the idea is that there are different systems that should be activated with different types of responses. We should see not just one part of the brain or another part of the brain, but actually a brain activity in a series of different types of parts of the brain that would correspond with a fairness violation, correspond with a harm violation, correspond with a purity violation, or an authority violation, right? And that's what this research does. This one, we'll start collecting the data in January. We're supposed to collect it this semester, we can get to it. And basically the task is a person perception task. And we show people faces, and of course it's the same faces that are randomly followed by different types of descriptions of behaviors that these people perform. So here, this person deliberately harmed another person. this person sacrificed themselves to care for another person. So we have a whole bunch of these different types of descriptions, and the faces, of course, are randomly assigned to the different tasks. And what we're doing is trying to see whether or not we can identify different types of brain system activation patterns associated with these different types of violations. And these are written, of course, to adhere to or violate the different domains. And then we'll see whether or not the predicted patterns of neural response are consistent with the patterns that we observe. Right? So that's what we're doing here. We've also got some research that kind of shows that this can predict how people respond to video games, which is kind of fun. I told you a little bit earlier that we had written scenarios that would adhere to or violate the 5 different domains. Nick Bowman took those scenarios and created a video game with those so that people could play the game and they could choose to adhere to or violate these different types of behaviors. And then had people, they measured this, used the MFQ to measure how salient the different domains were, and then had people play the game. And they found out that your scores on the foundation questionnaire predicted what you enjoyed in the game. So that most of the time, of course, people wouldn't violate the domains that were most salient to them. If the domain wasn't salient to you, then your willingness to perform an act in the game that would violate it was random. But if the domain was salient to you, you were clearly less likely to violate that domain. And then we see how people responded to it. We find out that when people chose to uphold the foundation that was most salient to them, that's when they enjoyed it most. And when they tried to uphold the foundation, but the game wouldn't let them, or the game punished them for it, that's when they enjoyed it the least. Right? So again, for us to say, hey, look, this stuff does seem to be predicting response. And we found that, again, encouraging.
There are video games that uphold those foundations?
No, we created them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nick took the stories that we had written and created the video games.
Oh,
yes.
how cool is that?
Yeah, I think it's real cool. Nick and the Germans, so I don't want to leave the Germans.
Okay.
Junck and Junck, right? Yes.
Probably should have asked this earlier. When you're using the term salient, are you talking about it in terms of accessibility or importance?
Accessibility. Now, and to some extent, of course, accessibility can lead to importance and be defined as importance. But yes, we're talking, especially when we talk about these AMP measures, where it's clearly that we're not trying to talk about somebody's self-reported perception of how important this is to them. Does that help?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that on those AMP measures? Because like you showed the picture with the guy, with the stop sign from
Yes.
the whatever, and you said that represented authority. But my gut reaction was that it was a harm here thing, because to me that's a crossing guard to make sure kids don't get hit by a car.
Yes.
So how do you judge what a picture represents to a person who's making
Yes.
a judgment?
We go through a whole bunch of steps with this, right? We start off with about 200 different pictures. And we ask people to go out and evaluate these along 5 domains. And we see that people, and we again, right? So we start off by having people judge them. We select about 200 images that there seems to be distinct differences in terms of how much it represents one domain or another. And then we have them, we measure their intuitive response to it and use factor analysis to see whether or not there seems to be consistency. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, and I'm not saying that we haven't yet, but we're still working on it.
I thought the bull one was justice, because the guy shouldn't have been messing with the bull.
Now remember, if you think about it,
Right,
it's,
then he's right.
But
And I didn't even realize what it was. At
Exactly.
first I just knew, oh, that's bad.
Right.
Scary.
I was
Yeah.
talking about a gut reaction, because to me a crossing guard is somebody who cares to make sure children are hurt. Like that's intuitive when you get
Yes.
yes. I didn't think really about it. When you said authority, that's what violated, which is why I started thinking.
yes, that's not how most people think. I can tell you that much.
I might be weird.
No, and I'm not saying that these don't affect other domains at all, right? It's clear that they are likely to be some bleed over.
You're on?
Yes, am I done?
I have another 5 minutes.
Yes, I was just gonna kind of go through some of these quickly, since, like I said, I'll talk forever. Automatic responses. What's this one? Oh yeah. This one we have it's kind of some fun research on how priming the concept of heroes and villains can affect people's behavior. There's existing research to show, Norton and Nelson's research shows that if you prime concepts of hero, that people will judge themselves and others as more likely to help. They'll actually volunteer more, afterwards, and even show up, months later. Now, they don't believe that the simple prime affected them showing up months later. They believe the public commitment affected them showing up months later, but the prime affected the public commitment. What we're trying to do is replicate that with media stimuli to see if we can see the same effect. And this, of course, is an example of an exemplar influencing the types of foundation and salience that we're interested in. And another study that's going to test this notion of appraisal and reappraisal. I'll just go to the slide real quickly and show basically what we do is we have people read different scenarios, we present them with different endings. Some of the endings are conflicted, some of the endings are not conflicted, some of the endings are positive, some of the endings are negative, and we try to see how quickly they respond and whether or not they evaluate these positively and negatively the way we predict. And of course, our prediction is that if it's conflicted, it's going to take them longer to respond. And if it does, and if they in a manner that we are predicting, then that will be consistent with our. This one we'll start collecting in just a few weeks, actually. Yeah, here's some stuff on the production of adherent content. We have been. I'll talk about it for a second first before I go there. We started to conduct content analysis. We believe that if cultures differ in terms of how salient these different domains are for them, we should see differences in the content from different cultures. We started to do this first with content analysis of Spanish-speaking and English-speaking soap operas, right? So we have a week-long sample of soap operas from Spanish-speaking networks and English-speaking networks, and then we've had people coding those soap operas using schemes to represent the 5 different domains. And also to see not only how often does it represent those domains, but how often does it adhere to a violator. So we find out overall that there's a difference between Spanish and English-speaking soap operas. Interestingly, the Spanish-speaking soap operas are neutral more often, right? Both are, of course, supportive more often and negative less, but there's quite a big difference in terms of U.S. soap operas negating more. In other words, they will violate those foundations more often. And when we look at the 5 different foundations, we can see that, interestingly, authority and fairness are 2 of the areas that are particularly different in terms of how often English-speaking soap operas are likely to violate. We found that interesting because we already had seen how English culture seemed to differ in the representation of heroes. Right? Now we're doing this type of work to see if there are differences that exist in the content between different cultures. This is the supporting ones, but I'll skip that since we have to go next. We also are, of course, starting to do research on Chinese soap operas, on Hindi soap operas, and on German soap operas. And I have different students from different cultures that are starting to do those soap operas to see if we can see those same types of differences. And then, of course, what we want to do, we already know, for example, and also, by the way, we're also going to look at, I'm not just interested in soap opera, I'm not just interested in entertainment, I'm very interested, I've always been interested in children's books, because I think that's a place where you really see some of the stuff clearly. Music, news, and then, of course, we'll start, this like, I'll skip this one. But we actually have a study where we manipulated exposure to this. We knew this was coming out because one of the producers was one of my students' brothers.
So it's a TV show?
It's an online soap opera. You guys have seen it?
No, but it sounds like something like
that. Yeah, so it's very brief, like 10 minutes a week, 2 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 8 weeks. And we had our students watch this stuff for 8 weeks and saw that compared to a control group, the people that had, there were differences between the control group and the people who watched this stuff for 8 weeks in terms of how they responded to particularly harm and purity. We found that there were differences in those domains, which was kind of fun. But I'll skip that one. This one is what we want to do is to look at the content analysis to see if the content, for example, we're starting with the German content analysis. Will the content show the pattern that we see here in domain salience among Germans. That's what we want to see. We already see some evidence that the US content looks like this. Will the German content look like that? If that's true, then again, we're starting to feel more confident about what we have here. And that, there's a lot to do. We have to look at all these things together. That's tough. I mean,
A couple of minutes of any final questions, anybody have any questions?
When you're looking at the narratives and enjoyment, have you also thought about the concept of narrative engagement or transportation and what role that, have you seen?
well, thank God she's here, because now I can answer. She's gone, because now I can answer.
Melanie?
No, it's kind of, sure. Yes,
Oh, really?
the concept of engagement and transportation are very, very different. I've done a lot of research. If you're familiar with that literature, you might also be familiar with literature on presence, telepresence, identification, empathy, and of course,
That's our areas.
Yeah. To me, it's a conceptual quagmire. Okay, that in order to be able to conceptually distinguish those things, it's so difficult to do. In fact, I had one of my students who was going to do his dissertation on that concept, and he spent 6 months trying to define them and quit and decided to go into social media. And I told him when he started, I said, this is a great, if you can resolve that problem, good luck. Peter Border emailed me a few weeks ago and said, we're going to put a panel together at, what's the next one coming up? What deadline just passed? ICA. And we want to have different people talk about character identification in video games, because I've done some work there. And he asked me to do it. And he said, give me a response by Monday the 25th. And I waited to the 26th and said, oh gosh, I missed that deadline. I would love to have been on that panel with you guys. But I know if I was, I just would have made everybody mad, so I didn't.
I think part of the reason, it's hard to disentangle engagement or identification is the whole notion of the dual process, automatic and emotionally driven responses and rational. In your model, there was only like a dash one-way arrow, but I wonder
From what to what?
From the automatic responses and the rational responses, and I'm wondering the extent to which you think they're reciprocally determining, because when you're immersed in a media experience, it goes on for like an hour, 2 hours, and you can find yourself, acting emotionally and then thinking about stuff, and then maybe using that as a basis to determine future, reactions throughout the rest of the movie. To what extent do you think that's the case?
You said a whole bunch of different things. Which one are you saying? I think it's what's the case?
Whether they're reciprocally determining emotional and rational responses.
Now I see what you're asking. Yes. So in other words, well, remember, I do believe that the way we respond will eventually influence the way which of those intuitive responses occur. Do I think that a rational response can affect your inherent weight of salience? I think that it can temporarily make something more salient for you for a little while, but in terms of having some enduring effect on that, again, I think that's going to be a longer process, right? Which is why the model suggests that will happen. It suggests that will happen through the production of content that adheres to these different types of protocols, okay? And that if you can consistently have content that focuses on certain types of responses that are made without thought, then we'll develop a strong gut reaction to certain types of domains. If you consistently have content that forces you to think about certain types of issues and the conflict between them, then it might make the conflict itself more salient. And like I said, a little bit earlier I said, this isn't in my model, but I do think that this is, because it's too hard to integrate right now. But I think that it is the case that in certain areas where there are conflict within the domain itself, and the society hasn't figured out how to resolve that conflict, you'll actually see a considerable focus on that, and you'll see a focus on conflict in those domains. And that continued focus on the conflict within that domain is likely to bring the conflict to the level of awareness in the culture, and eventually lead the culture to decide which one should be adhered to and which one should be subjugated or suppressed. If that answers the problem that I tried.
Final questions? Thank you.
Francesca, you can ask me afterwards if you want.